I'm delighted to welcome so many people in this session on the Commonwealth and media freedom. Where do we stand? Excellent, excellent, excellent. Thank you very much. I would like to begin this session then, please. I'm Dr. Sue Onslow. I'm Director of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies in the School of Advanced Study here in the University of London. And it's my particular pleasure to chair this session on the Commonwealth and media freedom, where do we stand? I'm delighted to welcome onto the panel two experts of global standing in Zaffar Abbas and William Horsley. We are very much hoping that Ifill Gallagher will be able to join us, but she has a very pressured schedule in court this morning, so that may not prove possible, but we're keeping our fingers crossed that she will be able to take part in the panel discussion. We are also honoured that our discussant is Professor Jackie Harrison, who is Director for the Centre of Freedom of Media at the University of Sheffield, and is herself the UNESCO Chair on Safety and Journalists and Issues of Impunity. I hope I have that title correctly, Jackie. Please correct me if I don't. And Jackie is, of course, also author of The Civic Power of the News. So in setting out in terms of how this discussion will be run, Zaffar Abbas, of course, who is editor of the leading English language newspaper Dawn in Pakistan and winner of the prestigious prize in 2019, for his work on media freedom, will be making the first contribution, followed by William Horsley, whom I will introduce when it comes to his point. We're hoping, as I say, that Ifill will be able to join us. Then we would like to generate a panel discussion because we have asked our panelists if they could address, as they see it from their perspectives, the principal challenges to media freedom within the Commonwealth and what could be done, accepting, of course, this is a complex and multifaceted challenge, what could be done to address some, possibly all, some of these issues. We are recording this event, so I would ask when we move to the question and answer session that you identify yourself and your particular institutional affiliation. So thank you very much. So as part of my introductory remarks, please, I'd like to note that this is the 20th anniversary of the UN Action Plan on the Safety of Journalists. So I think this is an entirely appropriate time for us to take stock of where the Commonwealth as a global subsystem sits on issues, on these fundamental issues of media freedom and the place of media, it could be said, in democratic governance. Of course, in 2013, the Commonwealth member states signed a charter, and Chapter 5 on freedom of expression reads, "We are committed to peaceful, open dialogue and the free flow of information, including through a free and responsible media, and to enhancing democratic traditions and strengthening democratic processes." Now, of course, as we all know, in our place in the Commonwealth system, the Commonwealth is a values-based association. It is not a treaty association. Thus, these are aspirational values. They are not binding treaty commitments. So that is an important point, I think, to bear in mind, but that then should then give us a point to say, where are we now, 9 years on, from the signing of that Commonwealth Charter? The Institute of Commonwealth Studies launched its own centre to address and to cover, to study, to highlight the challenges to media freedom across the Commonwealth in April of 2017. And at our inaugural conference, the Secretary General of the Commonwealth, Patricia Scotland, made a keynote address. And in this, she expressly made reference to the need for the Commonwealth to show collective resolve to address freedom of media by working together to implement the UN Action Plan on safety of journalists and the issue of impunity. Secretary General Patricia Scotland has come back to underline the importance of collective action at a number of occasions since that particular event. Of course, while he was Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt also put support for media freedom at the heart of Britain's foreign policy with his launch of the Media Freedom Coalition. And just as a stock-taking exercise, I looked at the current list, and of the current 52 countries that have signed up to it, 12 are members of the Commonwealth, which, since there are 54 members of the Commonwealth as an association, certainly shows room for improvement, it could be said. Now, also, the Institute has regularly held stock-taking exercises on the place of media freedom and challenges to media freedom across the Commonwealth. Most recently, in January of 2020, an event that I organised with William Horsley and other members of the Commonwealth Journalists Association, we put together a high-level event at the House of Commons to discuss the Commonwealth's track record and the range of policy options to respond to global challenges. And our distinguished speakers were led by Amal Clooney, who was then UK envoy on media freedom and deputy chair of the high-level legal panel. And we actively worked with Akbar Khan, then Secretary General of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, Rebecca Vincent, Director of the London Office of Reporters Without Borders, was another panellist, and our fourth panellist was the then serving High Commissioner for Ghana. So I think this is after the tumult and the pressures stemming from the COVID pandemic, this is an appropriate time for us as engaged observers, activists, academics within the Commonwealth space to look at where we are now and what more can be done. So with that, I'd like to pass the microphone to Zaffar Abbas to make his opening remarks. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Onslow, and a lot of thanks to Commonwealth Journalists Association to even considering me to speak at this forum. I won't say I'm an authority on what's going on in most of the Commonwealth countries, and I will leave it for William Horsley to go into details about that. But I'll start with the situation in Pakistan and will try to expand it to other South Asian countries, what is happening there and what can possibly be done and what role can Commonwealth play in it. In Pakistan, it's been a huge struggle for journalists, or in the past few decades, just struggle to ask for the kind of freedom that is needed, that is also a right to inform the people about what is going on in various institutions controlled by the government, about the insurgency going on in different areas. We did manage to achieve some independence, say about 2 decades back, but since then there have been one curve after another and attempts to silence critics of the government, critics of the security institutions, largely because some of the journalists took a bold step of talking about these things, what was going on. So there came a phase where there were kidnappings, abductions, journalists were tortured, and there were a series of cases where journalists were killed in Pakistan. And whether some members of the security agencies were involved or militant organizations were involved, but our view was that this culture of impunity will continue in Pakistan unless those responsible are brought to justice. Because what had been happening was a clear message was being sent to various organizations that they can abduct journalists, they can kill journalists, and they can get away with it. So this culture of impunity has been there because till this date, probably 1 or 2 cases out of more than 80 cases of journalists being killed in Pakistan have been brought to justice or solved. So this culture remains. For a variety of reasons, the number of killings have gone down, but in a different way, journalism and journalists are being pressurized, forced to give in to the dictates of the authorities. So some of us call it a new tactics. that probably killing journalists is bad for international reputation. It's much better to go for killing journalism in Pakistan. So this is exactly what is being done over here by bringing in kind of laws to stop honest or free criticism of the authorities or their policies, to start vicious campaign on the social media attacking journalists who have been honest and who have been talking about their freedoms, and especially the women journalists. I cannot even go into the details about the way filthy language is used on social media to attack women journalists in Pakistan, and encouraged by the authorities in many ways. There have been clear instances where journalists have been called out in worst kind of language on the social media by senior officials of the government. I'm talking about the former government, uh, uh, because very recently there a change to take place in Pakistan. On top of that, have been all kinds of laws are being attempted to control the electronic media, to channel, to bring in a so-called media regulatory authority in Pakistan. And the single idea is not to let the critics of this state institutions or government get away with it. So freedom of the press is really under threat in Pakistan. And what is happening is, in the last 2 years, or I'll say over a decade, in a very sustained manner, a kind of ultra-nationalism is being built, that there is a need for a single narrative on all major policies in Pakistan. A single narrative about Pakistan's foreign policy, Pakistan's security institutions, even Pakistan's economy, and there is little room for even questioning these policies. And whoever tries to question it is branded anti-state and traitor. And this mixture of supranationalism or ultranationalism and religion has created such a toxic atmosphere in Pakistan that a number of journalists have either decided to leave the profession or have gone into exile. So this is a very sad situation. The struggle goes on, but for the first time, I have started to feel really depressed that it is, after all these decades, it is not taking us anywhere. In fact, with this social media trolls attacking journalists who have been independent over a period of time, who have got reputation, is really, really hurting us. There was a time that many journalists in Pakistan used to take inspiration from the level of press freedom in our neighboring country, India. But what many of us have witnessed now in the last few years, that probably the situation in India, if not worse, is certainly not better than what is happening in Pakistan. In fact, in India, the way the ruling party and their supporters have been using the religion card to go after journalists, and using this ultranationalism to go after journalists, has created a very dangerous situation over here. And if we move away from India, go to Bangladesh, I won't say that the government has been using the religion card, but their secular authoritarianism, the way they have gone after critics in Bangladesh, that hardly a few journalists are left over there who can really take the bold step of questioning government policies over there. So in South Asia, or in most countries in South Asia, the situation is very depressing. So what can be done about it? You see, my position has always been that, yes, this is our struggle, and we will continue to fight for more freedom in this country. But a collective voice from the international fraternity of journalists always helps. It makes the government of the day realize that, yes, people outside Pakistan are aware of the situation, and they will not stop questioning the government policies unless we listen to the journalist fraternity in Pakistan. And that is where Commonwealth comes in. This is an organization where most Pakistanis or most Indians or most Bangladeshis can relate to because of the colonial past. And we realize that yes, similar situations or maybe even worse exist in many other Asian countries or African countries. So if we were to speak with one voice, it can make a difference. And Dr. Onslow, you rightly pointed out that Commonwealth is not an organization which can bind a state for doing something, but there is something called a moral pressure. If we agree to this kind of a charter where UNESCO has been calling about all the press laws about impunity against culture of violence, against social media attacks, women journalists, and so many other things. It will make a huge difference on media regulatory authorities, culture of impunity, threats to journalists, about anti-press laws in these countries. And countries in Asia and Africa, their governments, we may not succeed in 1 day or 2 days, but if Commonwealth to agree to what people like William Horsley and others have been doing over a period of time to make them understand there is a need to have these kind of principles to send a message, I personally believe it will make a very big difference.
Thank you very much indeed, Zaffar, for those powerful points, underlining the importance of the collective voice and the access of multiple actors across the Commonwealth to speak, as you say, in support of media freedom. Academics based in this country have said that there is a drumbeat of support for media freedom, but they've identified that different media cultures are opening up, and certainly the media culture that you point to is one of shall we say, negative rights and increasing constriction of that space, with your emphasis on the ideology of a single narrative, which in fact can be identified as a trend across South Asia. If I could now move to invite William Horsley to make his first remarks. William is International Director for the Centre of Freedom of Media at the University of Sheffield, and also a member of the Executive Board of the Commonwealth Journalists Association. He has been an important international journalist, reporting on major world events as a BBC foreign correspondent across Europe, Asia, and as a TV and radio presenter. He is a leading advocate for media freedom, and he also sits on the UK Advisory Board for RSF, that's Reporters Without Borders. And in 2015, William assisted in the establishment of the Council of Europe's online platform for the safety of journalists, which is a Europe-wide early warning system against all forms of assault on press freedom. So as an author and journalist, we're delighted to now give the floor to William.
Thank you very much indeed, Sue, and good afternoon, everybody, wherever you are in the world. Sue, I have to thank you for your inspiration in founding the Centre on the Commonwealth and Media Freedom back in 2017, which is proving its value now. And thanks to Zaffar for being an inspiration from Pakistan in one of the main battlegrounds for media freedom across the world. As you said, 80 plus journalists killed down the years. Now, after me, of course, it'll be Keelan, if she's able to be here, talking about another arena in the law courts of the fight for journalist safety and so on. I am going to address something at least as gripping, which is the battle going on within the Commonwealth family on these issues, although I will take a side glimpse at some of the landscape for attacks on the media in the rest of the Commonwealth, because I think we need to understand the scale and ferocity of this onslaught, which I think Zaffar characterized very well, the mixture of ultranationalism and ideology or religion. But the basics, as many people will know are that this story of the attempt to by civil society launched attempts to get the Commonwealth to adopt a set of principles and then abide by it. It's been going on for 5 years. It's called the Principles on the Commonwealth and Freedom of Expression and the Role of Media in Good Governance. It involves 6 organizations, including ourselves, the journalists, the lawyers, the parliamentarians, and others. It's important that it includes guidelines concerning the relationship between media and all the branches of government. So it's a sort of complementary text to the Latimer House principles, which are part of the Commonwealth's fundamental principles adopted by heads of government. So this hopefully might go the same way. Now, I pay tribute at the start to my colleagues, especially David Page and Rita Payne, and all those from the other Commonwealth associations we've been working with, because their support and inspiration on this odyssey has been fantastic. Now, you mentioned that I've been working for the Council of Europe and OSCE. I think it's worth just highlighting the fact that the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe 25 years ago had the courage of its convictions, despite being only a consensus organization, not treaty, to establish an independent office of the representative on media freedom, whose role is to warn, to advise, and to basically be an early warning system. So that's the kind of thing that the Commonwealth could have done before. Sue, you know better than anybody the story of the attempt to have a human rights commissioner, the attempt to strengthen the role of the Commonwealth Media Ministerial Action Group, and so on. But just to remind anybody who doesn't know the story, it was the Commonwealth Journalists meeting in 2016 which really impelled this movement, because our journalists, colleagues from Africa, from South Asia and other parts were looking to the Commonwealth because they felt desperate for the reasons I think that Zaffar has outlined. And it's important to say that these principles are not just about protecting the interests of journalists. It's the public's right to be informed that is at stake. And also, in the words of the Latimer House document, the role of the media in promoting government transparency and accountability. And I think the key point to start with is that the Commonwealth is not being allowing itself to be held accountable, and that is not good enough. So part 2 of what I want to say, I'll take in 4 parts, hopefully keep to time. Now, this is not an audit session, and the Commonwealth is not about pointing fingers at individual states, but it's necessary to get a clear understanding, as we've had from Pakistan already, the scale and nature of the attempts all over the world, really, by political forces and other unscrupulous forces to suppress reporting of corruption and political activity. So very quickly, let's have a look at the RSF website showcase on the worst offenders on media freedom, not only China and Iran and so on, but these Commonwealth states. Uganda first. RSF points to frequent verbal attacks by the president himself that's serving as a green light for harassment of journalists by the security services, the use of physical violence, arbitrary arrest, censorship, constant internet disconnections, economic pressure, and state pressure on businesses not to place advertisements and so starve those critical media of funds. Bangladesh, the Digital Security Act of 2018, a major weapon, RSF says, to make journalists censor themselves. Online content that's described as liable to disturb public order. That is an arbitrary decision by the executive to decide what is and is not fit for print, punishable 7 years in jail. Online security law has led to 400 prosecutions. And of course, we know about the brutal killings of bloggers in Bangladesh. Rwanda, hosting the Commonwealth Summit in June, a legacy of abuse of the media, through the media, to fan racial hatred in the 1994 genocide, of course. Now RSF talks about censorship and self-censorship being pervasive. for any journalists because they want to avoid being targeted by government reprisals. They've recorded killings and disappearances of 8 journalists since 1996, and many forced into exile. And then finally, India, RSF highlighting legal threats to legitimate freedom of the media, journalists risking life imprisonment under vague, sweeping sedition laws, and armies of government supporting trolls waging hate campaigns, and women journalists in particular being subjected to public calls for them to be gang raped and other horrible things. So this is not the occasion to engage a conversation with those or any other states, but I think the graphic nature of these accounts does tell us that the Commonwealth cannot sit on the sidelines anymore. We have to have an open public debate on this. And today, I think, is a good chance to launch, in a way, the idea of civil society inviting states to join that and to offer our resources as to help in a common cause. And I'll elaborate that a little bit more later. But quickly, I want to remind you of what Anne Gallagher, the Director General of the Commonwealth Foundation, wrote very recently, saying that Commonwealth marches in lockstep with the world trends towards authoritarianism and backsliding of democratic regimes. Over 80% of the Commonwealth's 2.4 billion citizens are living in what Civicus, the think tank, classifies as repressed societies, public protest banned, human rights defenders and journalists intimidated, laws censor vital information and restrict media freedom. So that's the scale of it. Now, the exam question, where does the Commonwealth really stand? I think it's important to point out what a high bar the Commonwealth itself has set for itself. Its institutional commitment is clear in the Charter, as you, Sue, pointed out at the beginning, in the name of the people of the Commonwealth, not just the states, the people. It makes unequivocal commitment to freedom of expression. Let's hear the people's voice then. To freedom of expression, free flow of information, and free and what it calls responsible media. It also says the Commonwealth is committed to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other relevant human rights covenants and international instruments. Now, this is important because the most important one, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ratified by most Commonwealth states, interprets the importance of freedom of expression and free media as being special significance because they give effect to a range of other basic rights. And this connects with what Zaffar was saying about the political process being corrupted, because those rights include the right of free association, access to justice, and the right to vote in free and fair elections. So the rule of law and freedom of expression intimately linked. It also, the Charter also acknowledges the surge in popular demand. So the Commonwealth has acknowledged that, and yet it is silent. It is sitting on the sidelines. And you mentioned Patricia Scotland's own personal commitment to the thing. Now, I've been personally very impressed by a lot of the grassroots organizations in the Commonwealth. Look at the Human Rights Initiative, its work on modern slavery. Look at the Commonwealth Magistrates and Justice Association, putting out alerts against all kinds of abuses against the judiciary, attempts to undermine it and interfere with the judicial process. So we need that kind of commitment to move in our direction. So because the institutional Commonwealth has not lived up to that. And if you look at the one organ which does have power, the Ministerial Action Group, there are 8 areas of fundamental values, including what's called systematic constraints on civil society and the media, where it is empowered to take action, and yet it's notably silent. In fact, one of our colleagues in one of these previous sessions, and you may remember, Sue, said CMAG stands for the Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group. It might be better described as the Ministerial Inaction Group. Now, point 3, I'll be quick now, Sue. 2 more parts. Briefly on the state of play on the Principles Initiative itself. A few weeks ago, we learned the process of considering them for possible adoption by governments is effectively delayed until the second half of this year. So no chance of getting them through in this upcoming Chogam in Rwanda. There's been very little public information. That is another defect, I'm afraid, of the Commonwealth system. But in February last year, thanks to representations by friendly media Commonwealth states, which we much appreciate, a meeting was held of senior law ministry officials, which gave a mandate to the Secretariat for the first time to set up an online conference called an expert working group of self-selecting members of member states as a priority of the Commonwealth to examine the substantive issues addressed in the 2018 draft, which you've got up on screen, I think, Sue, of the principles by our 6 organizations. Now, those discussions were held, but under Chatham House rules. So I'm afraid it's confidential. They're not published. The revised text, revised by the member states in certain ways, is not published. There were naturally thorny issues, complex deliberations, and so on. So now we're kind of on a pause on that. Now, I'm not at liberty to talk about the text or the nature of the points of controversy, but I can say clearly, as a matter of principle, that the CJA and other civil society organizations are concerned about particular areas where the defense of the right of independent media to hold governments to account is intimately connected with the democratic rights of people. And they include the ending of over-restrictive laws and arbitrary laws, the state's commitment to apply minimum legal and regulatory controls, not the kind of comprehensive sweeping thing which we were talking about in Pakistan, and the effective protection from arbitrary arrest and the guarantees of judicial independence and protection of journalist sources. These are the things by which we live and breathe. Now, finally, to put some flesh on this idea of a more open and wider dialogue, I want to make 5 quick points. First, Peter Slynn, our esteemed colleague from the Commonwealth Legal Education Association, has reminded us in the past that when the Latimer House principles were adopted, the key moment came when a joint body was appointed. That is to say, with the sponsoring organizations, the civil society, and the member states. There is a precedent for this. It could happen again. Secondly, UNESCO, the UN agency, is already inviting the Commonwealth to join the international debate as a main player. 2 years ago, it established a so-called light touch international task force for intergovernmental organizations, including African Union, Council of Europe, Francophonie, OSCE, Commonwealth, and others. The idea to align step by step these organizations with what they do with the UN overriding action plan, which has more than 100 action lines. And as you say, is 10 years old this year. And this year would be a damn good time for the Commonwealth to step forward and announce that it's part of it and what it's going to do. Thirdly, well, basically, that's my third point, that this is the year to do it. And the Commonwealth has already, I think, espoused the so-called Paris principles, which do encourage governments to embrace respectful consultations with NGOs in all these important areas. Fourthly, 2 things which can be done by the Commonwealth with its unique power at the United Nations, in line entirely with the Commonwealth's own beliefs. SDG number 16, accountable institutions, access to justice, access to information, and the target 16.10.1 calls in particular for UN member states to collect information and report it on attacks, including killings, abductions, torture, enforced disappearances, other acts of violence, and against media workers, human rights defenders, and trade unionists. Now, this is a thing that CFOM in Sheffield is engaged with. Jackie might want to say something about that, because it's the kind of area where the joint action by the NGOs, governments, experts, IT specialists, data specialists and so on, can really help to improve the record. And the Commonwealth has one of the worst records, unfortunately, in those areas, as we've heard. And fifthly, UNESCO carries out this really detailed, rigorous monitoring through its observatory of killings of journalists, and particularly requests for information about judicial follow-up. Zaffar made the point about impunity. Now, the Commonwealth states have one of the worst records in this. 96% of killings of journalists in Commonwealth states, according to UNESCO, go unpunished. That's much worse than the global average. If the Commonwealth believes in the rule of law, this would be a very good place to start. The Commonwealth could help to hold the ring, improve that record, and show itself off very well to the world. So let's open our minds. Please open that door, I plead, to Commonwealth, institutional Commonwealth, and let the dialogue begin.
William, thank you very much indeed for that very detailed presentation of forceful argument on the need for a broad institutional approaches, I should say, with an S, and for giving a granular approach of where there could be substantive movement and encouragement. Jackie, I believe that Kieran hasn't been able to join us. I haven't seen her anywhere. I'm just skipping quickly through the screen. No, I believe that she hasn't been able to. So if I could call on you, please, to make your remarks on the observations of Zaffar and William, and then I will generate a discussion among panelists before moving to Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thanks very much for inviting me to speak today, and thank you very much for the really excellent presentations from Zaffar and from William. And you know, the breadth and depth of the knowledge that comes into these kind of presentations is always really impressive to me, because obviously we tend to see these things as statistics or as data on a screen, but I think actually they're very, very, very real lived experience. And the work that William's doing and that you're doing at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, you know, really makes us realise, I think, as stakeholders in the journalism safety arena, just really how much effort is going on in different parts of the world in different ways for different reasons. But ultimately, we do have all the same goal. I think as the UNESCO chair on media freedom, journalism safety and the issue of impunity, I mean, it's very well, as well as the chair of CFOM, I think it's just really important to stress once again the expectation and importance of all UN member states and intergovernmental organisations like the Commonwealth aligning themselves actively with accepted international standards, goals, actions, lines of the UN Action Plan, as William said, and understanding and aligning with the SDGs, in particular reporting back through the monitoring mechanism 1610.1. And of course, with all the multiple UN resolutions on the safety of journalists and the problem of impunity, there is a normative framework in place. There are mechanisms in place. And when I hear what William and Zaffar have been saying, you know, it strikes me very much that there are tactical changes going on in you know, from different politicians behaving in different ways in different countries. I was interested in the comment that Zaffar made about killing journalism rather than journalists, and that is a trend that we've been looking at Sheffield. You know, the attacks on journalism as a very idea, as a concept, which, you know, notwithstanding the horrors of attacks on journalists themselves, which contributes to the diminishment of journalism, the actual attack on journalism actually undermines core civil values and civil society. And just thinking about, you know, referring back to the high bar, as William said, of, you know, the Charter of the Commonwealth with its freedom of expression expectations, the role of civil society is in there as being very much part of that, not just civil society as in civil society organisations, but civil society that involves people, ordinary people, who then seek to have a voice to respond to what's going on in societies. And all too often, where journalism has been diminished or journalists aren't free to report, they self-censor, or there's impunity, there's attacks upon them, what happens is then there's a diminishment of civil life, and it is very, clearly connected. And we can say the same thing in different ways, but it's the right for people to know, it's the right for journalists to be able to go and collect information and report it freely. But nonetheless, wherever that is actually undermined, there is a diminishment of the civil sphere, of civil society, of people being able to hold governments to account themselves. And also this chilling effect of this downward spiral. Not only is there a downward spiral where impunity is rife, there's also a downward spiral where the civil sphere itself or civil society is diminishing or is more or less non-existent in the ways that we would recognise it. And I was thinking about also the idea of something else that's come up there as well, is that there's a tremendous work that's been going on. There's the missed opportunities by the Commonwealth that William's outlined, and obviously the continued work that through civil society organisations to keep pushing this onto the agenda, which is really, really important. But there is a kind of sliding scale of communicative circumstances that arise, and they overlap in different states, so it's hard to label a state with a particular circumstance. But just thinking about it, where authoritarianism is rife in a particular state, whether through state actors, basically weaponizing the rule of law and or the constitution against independent media, and the forceful domination and persecution of critical journalism, as Zaffar mentioned, in Pakistan, but also the loss of example that could have been set by India as the neighbour, but actually that diminishment is where a repressive state slides into authoritarian state circumstances for journalism. And it's very easy in the context of that spectrum of, an open and enabling environment for journalists to slip through into something much more antagonistic, which we're seeing in many previously free states, where journalism is suffering, under that, journalists and the idea, the very concept of journalism is being attacked. It brings about, that antagonism brings about a gradual breakdown in respectful contestation due to intermediate rivalries, but state bias, but it displays hostility, enmity, and facilitates the emergence of a networked new partisan silos, and features the emergence of a vocabulary of truth and untruths, loyalty and disloyalty, as well as irreconcilable differences. And it's not very far of a stretch to go from that antagonistic world into a different type of communicative circumstance, which is that of repression, which sees a complete breakdown of that respectful contestation. And it's been replaced by a climate of state chilling towards certain out of favour media outlets, and also economic distortions and market biases with regard to ownership and different sorts of tactics that may be used. If we put all of those together, from what I might call an agonistic, environment, which is relatively free, where you have respectful contestations and journalists are allowed to operate freely, all the way through antagonistic settings, repressive settings, through to authoritarian contextual settings, what you get there is a sliding scale where journalism itself can move along, and journalism as a concept and as an idea comes under attack, as do the journalists themselves in different ways. And we can see that there's a whole toolkit there for different ways of attacking journalists. And so how does that actually resonate with what we've been talking about today? Well, obviously that variety of intensity of those different communicative contexts are present within your Commonwealth 54 states. It's there, we have states that do operate more freely, all the way through to states that are absolutely, killing journalists, kidnapping them, torturing, the whole list that unfortunately has been presented today. So there is something about the Commonwealth itself working, I think, as a stakeholder organisation amongst the international community and stepping up, but also within the Commonwealth, there are also states that, and I know they do to some extent, but there are also, there's an imperative for states to lead by example as well, and not to, to recognise publicly if their communicative circumstances are slipping along that spectrum that I've just been talking about. Because where we see a backsliding or states reverting back to certain sort of tactics or weaponizing the law or allowing impunity to be so rife at 98% shocking, then that needs calling out both within the Commonwealth, but also for the Commonwealth to recognise that as part and parcel of its constitution. And that's where I think the principles that are so important need to be, not only written down as principles, but the key is actually going to be very much, as always with these things, in the implementation of those. And the kind of things you can do to implement them are obviously numerous. But one of the things that we've been looking at at the University of Sheffield is this, improved shadow monitoring, helping states where the political actors particularly don't want to necessarily report back what's going on in terms of attacks on journalists, to actually help and facilitate and empower shadow monitoring organisations to do a really, a better job, because that data is important, not just for reporting to UNESCO, but it's important worldwide, and it's important for academics to be able to see that data, improve data, in order to dig more deeply and actually interrogate what's going on. So that was just my observations at the moment. I don't know if I've touched on everything that I should have done. Apologies if I haven't, but it's, I'm more than happy to say something else, but obviously there are other people in the call and I'd like to hand back over now. Thank you.
Jackie, thank you very much indeed for that very wide-ranging, conceptual and deeply thoughtful comments and reflections on the dynamics and processes of change, and the progressive, the coalescence of erosions of media freedoms that are multifaceted, but that are also, as you say, driven by political actors, but also by trends and outlooks and cultures across countries. And just to reflect on a comment that Lord Black, who's chair of the Telegraph Group, said to the inaugural conference of the Institute's Challenge to Media Freedom Centre, was that each generation has to fight the battles of media and freedom, each generation, so that we can, as we're obviously witnessing very closely in these fraught times, that developments towards media freedom are not linear, they are not determinist and inherently progressive, that there has been sharp regressions across the globe, and the Commonwealth as a global subsystem has sadly not been immune to these pressures. I would like to ask Zaffar and William their particular view of the question of political actors within the Commonwealth. So Jackie made reference to the Commonwealth as a collective and also the intra-Commonwealth dynamic. Zaffar, you expressly referred to the importance of the domestic environment. How far do you also see, the internal potential, internal action within Pakistan as a member of the Commonwealth? Do you see a coalescence of journalist solidarity and support, in addition to the importance of the Commonwealth lending its moral voice in support of freedom of expression and journalism and journalist ethics in Pakistan? Or do you see, in fact, shall we say, a fragmentation of different styles of journalism going forward, these media cultures with an S which are opening up, supported by Chinese, a different authoritarian approach to the role and the place of media that buys into a different narrative, supporting what is acceptable for the state and what is not?
Well, if we were to leave it to the Chinese model, there will be no journalism, not just in Pakistan and in many other countries. So, yes, so that is out of the question. Actually, the damage that has been done by an international leader in countries like Pakistan is by the former American President Donald Trump. When he started the campaign to dub credible journalism and credible reporting as fake news, it was immediately picked up by authoritarian rulers in developing countries and those who aspire to be authoritarian or the kind of intolerance that started with that, what that was used in countries like Pakistan, so many other countries, to unleash supporters of the ruling party to go after journalists. On social media, accusing them, blaming them, dubbing their stories as fake news. And that has now continued over a period of time. How to counter it? Of course, without building solidarity within the country, nothing is going to work. Fortunately, in Pakistan, a large section of the journalist fraternity is united, highly unionized, speak with one voice, and that draws the attention of the international community a lot, because if Pakistan Federal Union of Journalists is going to talk about these things, whether it is RSF or IPI or CPJ and so many other organizations, they listen to us and they raise their voice just for support. So solidarity at home is extremely important. There have also been some success stories, Dr. Onslow. For instance, a few years back, when a lot of killings and abductions were going on and threats to journalists were going on, we built an organization called Editors for Safety. And the single purpose of that organization was, when it comes to attack on, say, a journalist from Dawn or Jung or Geo or ARY or any other news organization, we will all speak with one voice on that. In the past, the commercial interests were stopping various media organizations from talking about attack on another media house and all those things. And that has been a big success in the sense that when there is threat or attack on one journalist from any media organization, we, the editors, speak with one voice, calling out the authorities to take action against that and try to stop it. So it's a small effort, but it has given its own results in a very positive way. If we were to expand these kind of models in many other Commonwealth countries where they can speak well, and then to tell the Commonwealth, yes, these are the success stories, we can succeed with the collective action, and please go for it.
No, thank you very much indeed. William, you've placed emphasis on the importance of institutional action. From your extensive experience as a professional journalist, would you also identify where there has been best practice of journalists' solidarity and building resilience against states weaponizing the law, weaponizing accusations of fake news, so that help to provide resilience for medium of expression?
Yeah, sure. You're right. It's so many parts of the world where they haven't had the experience of building up an independent media with the kind of diversity, with the kind of expectation of standards and the role of public, an informed public, having a dialogue with the informed public, and the media as a genuine mediator between them, in which obviously the media have to have a relationship with those in political power. They have to have a level of polite discourse, but they need to be completely free to then maul those journalists. And what I've observed, because I didn't study the law when I was a journalist, and I realized afterwards how foolish that was, because when I entered the Council of Europe arena and the UN arena, I realized that all this stuff is actually covered by laws, national laws and international laws, and there is a very important link between them. And this is part of the problem of the dialogue within the Commonwealth. This is a sensitive point, but I'll make it, that this idea of the Commonwealth as an equal and sovereign collection of states can be interpreted, it's a kind of shorthand really, for saying states in the end decide, and that what they, and there is a tendency for states to say that what their national law is trumps whatever commitment they've made in international law. And that is actually the opposite of what is supposed to happen. So this is the key to getting democracy spread around the world. And that's, if you look at not just the Council of Europe, but even the African Union, which is developing these norms and standards of behavior. They have various court cases, the ECOWAS courts, the African Court of Human Rights, and so on. They're producing these landmark cases on things like criminal defamation, impunity, the obligations of states. And that's backed by a panoply of organs of the UN, particularly not just the Human Rights Council with the Universal Periodic Review, not just the UN resolutions and the Security Council resolutions, but all the rapporteurs who monitor, they send so-called communications, and they put governments on the spot. And governments really, really don't like that. So that takes an awfully long time to evolve. And what you've seen even in Europe, but across the world, is in this climate of ultranationalism and ideological fervor, you see the media the capture is all too easy. And in fact, it's regarded as something patriotic. So you can't really have the independence from which genuine critical media comes. If I may, I'd just like to mention one positive thing. Keelan has not been able to join us, but she did represent the family of Daphne Caruana Galizia, killed in 2017. And that is the most horrendous story, because I helped to publish the book with the transcript of her last interview, where she was describing how she was simply scapegoated. The whole society was against her. You had politicians blogging, putting out notices for people to watch her wherever she went. She had arson attacks. She had 40 defamation cases against her. Her bank account was frozen. I mean, you could hardly be more persecuted than she was. And eventually they killed her with a remote controlled bomb. But in the end, the institutions did come to her rescue. It was the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, which set a deadline for the Maltese government. If you remember, the Prime Minister was forced to resign, although he was replaced by someone from the same party. And what happened was that the pressure from Strasbourg forced the government in Malta to open a more or less independent public inquiry, which found that the state itself was responsible for generating a culture of impunity and therefore responsible for the death of Daphne Caruana Galizia. Now, that's powerful stuff, even though it's still deeply entrenched conservative, authoritarian patterns of mind. It shows what can be done.
William, thank you very much indeed for, as you say, addressing the importance of Keelan's work, but also the complicity of the state in the persecution of journalists, drawing on the Maltese example, but how international institutions moving, albeit very slowly, can indeed move to call states to account. I know that there is a great deal of expertise in this virtual room, so I'm now going to move to the question and answer session. So if I could invite you, please, to raise your hands as yellow. I'm going to try and monitor the chat function as well, which is always something of a gymnastic exercise by a chair in this particular situation. So please bear with me while I do this. My first question I can see coming from Martin Crook, followed by a question from Martin Plout. Martin, if I could invite you to put your question to the panelists, please.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, lovely. Yeah, it's just two short questions. The first question I wanted to ask is about, well, I think is probably one of the most important issues regarding press freedom and freedom of expression is the case of Julian Assange, because we recently had the UK Magistrates Court decide to issue an order of extradition. And Amnesty International recently, this Secretary General argued that the extradition of Julian Assange would be devastating for press freedom and for the public, who have a right to know what their governments are doing in their name. And it goes on to say that not only is this, could pose as a violation of the prohibition against torture, but that it would set a very dangerous precedent, namely the idea that a foreign country can exercise extraterritorial criminal jurisdiction to prosecute a person publishing from the UK. Other governments might use this precedent to use the same legal apparatus to imprison journalists and silence the press far beyond the borders of their own countries. So that's the first issue and a question. So I want the panelists to respond to that. And the second question is, I think Alfred de Zayas, a former UN expert, made a really interesting point regarding the banning of RT in the UK, which is to say that I think in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, I believe it's Article 17, correct me if I'm wrong, it says that every citizen has the right to seek out and impart information regardless of borders in order to arrive at a judicious decision or assessment of affairs, something to that effect. So the idea that the UK, the United States can ban a news media organization, surely this constitutes a violation or transgression of not just our moral right to seek out impart information, but international law. So those are the two questions. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Martin. If I put those questions to our panelists, if they're able to answer them, I just want to say that we did invite Jennifer Robinson to take part in this discussion, and I'm afraid that she wasn't able to. She, of course, has been Julius Assange's representative. So it may be that we have to channel that particular question to another expert, but thank you. Zaffar and William, are you able to address those 2 points? The question of extraterritoriality, and then, if you like, state absolute sovereignty.
Zaffar, would you like to say something? I have some exposure to the Assange issue actually just today, but Zaffar, what do you think first?
Well, my position and position of my newspaper is pretty clear on this particular issue, although I know there has been a debate in many media organizations whether what Julian was doing was really journalism or whether it comes within the ambit of freedom of expression or not. Our position is clear. If a state extradites a person like Julian Assange, a clear message will be sent to many other countries that they can do similar things. To hand him over to the United States, where he's going to go to jail probably for many, many years, it will be a major blow to attempts to expose wrongdoings of any countries like the United States or Pakistan or India or so many other things. So I think there is a need to campaign for Britain to reverse it. Whether it's going to happen or not, I don't know. To the second issue that was raised about banning RT, we have absolutely no doubt about it that it is wrong. What Britain did or what EU did about, yes, we can go on questioning what Russia is doing in Ukraine and all those things. Even if we brand what RT was doing was a Russian propaganda, we cannot take a kind of a step to ban a media outlet from broadcasting. We have to leave it to the people to decide whether they want to watch BBC, Sky, RT, or any other television. To ban such a thing has sent a very wrong message that when it comes to conflicts, there can be intolerance even at the state level, and they can take irrational decisions.
Thank you very much, Zaffar. William, you have comments?
Yeah, I'll try and be brief because they're both fascinating questions from Martin. I agree with you entirely about the dangers of the precedent, particularly since what the application of the Espionage Act, which is the one that might send him to jail for 120 years, was basically wheeled in at a late stage. So, I mean, the legal shenanigans of keeping Assange in detention or on trial, originally, if you remember, it was alleged sexual assault and so on. I think that's all very fishy. but in particular, because the Espionage Act is now being used effectively to cover up potentially what would be war crimes. And that it's for that very reason that the Americans want to punish him. Now, this is very, very damaging for the international community and human rights standards worldwide, because if you want to hold Russia to account for war crimes, for example, in Crimea, in Ukraine or in Syria, it really isn't a very good idea for the US to cover up its own by all means possible. So it's really a very backward step. On the RT, and the other thing I think is that the grand jury on these very serious charges, I think that was done also in secret all those times when he was being held in very harsh conditions in a British jail. On the RT thing, my instinct is to agree with what Zaffar has said, and indeed I did at the time question it, because one of the journalist associations I'm involved with was campaigning for the EU to block RT. And I thought that was the wrong thing for a journalist association to do. Individual journalists can have their opinion, but it's not our job we can point out the risks, that's legitimate, but that's why we have a system involving independent regulators. And indeed, it was the Ofcom, the individual independent regulator, which sanctioned RT on a number of occasions, but did not ban it. So the EU took the first step, and then in practice, those RT broadcasts were anyway unobtainable in the UK. And then somehow, I don't know how the decision was taken for the ban for the British government or Ofcom. But again, it's important that that decision is taken by an independent regulator. Otherwise, you're driving a coach and horses through the idea of having independent oversight organizations. So, of course, there's one other point to make, which is that propaganda for war can be prosecuted as a war crime. And particularly if media are being used, as I'm sure they were, for example, in the Russian takeover of Crimea. If you remember, I don't know, scores of Russian journalists, state media, were taken into Crimea and used as part of the war effort in practice. Now that they haven't been prosecuted, it's too difficult to do it in Russia. But these are appalling precedents. But yes, I agree, restraint is really, really important. So if you're going to ban it has to be, for example, when Iran broadcast forced confessions from a journalist, forced confessions after torture, the Ofcom in this country acted against Press TV, quite rightly, because that is unacceptable to have the media used and the publicity used in that way for such a state, appalling state purposes.
Thank you very much, William, for underlining the dangers of such precedents in those two cases, and also my thanks to Zaffar for those very powerful observations. If I could take two questions, please, because I'm conscious that time is marching on. Martin Plaut, please, and then Kieran, if you could put your questions in succession to our panelists.
Thank you very much. And it's a great pleasure to see my old colleague Zaffar Abbas. What a tremendous role you've played in journalism all these years. I mean, somebody for whom I have the greatest respect. Let me just say, I'm sorry that this panel has had so little input from Africa or even the Caribbean. It is a real problem because particularly when CHOGM is going to be meeting in Rwanda. And the Rwandan case raises all the problems of both Commonwealth and murder of journalists and the oppression that has gone on. And the real problem with the African situation is that you have things from the very worst, and I don't know how many of you were aware of this, but actually Eritrea, something that I work on, is at the very bottom of the entire list of Reporters Without Borders. They are worse than North Korea. And the most frightening aspect of this is that the war in Ethiopia, which is now going on around Tigray, has involved the Ethiopians learning the lessons from Eritrea. So there's a pollution of ideas and repression from the one state to the other because they are allied. At the other end of this, you have the South African situation. Although the South Africans have seen Rwandan opposition figures murdered in their country, the reason that we know about it and the reason that there is some hope for South Africa, despite the appalling corruption that has been unleashed on it and the despondency that is now fallen upon South Africa, where even the Deputy Minister of the Treasury talks about South Africa heading towards becoming a failed state. And have you actually, any of you, heard that reported in Britain? Have one of you heard that reported in Britain? I doubt it. And frankly, that's an appalling indictment of our institutions in Britain, that they have failed to report that statement. So we have both the good and the bad. But what I would like to ask, particularly William, is, I am concerned about the way your report was really interesting and had much in it, but this kind of Chatham House business and being stuck behind closed walls and engaged with the Commonwealth, I wonder if we are not falling into this sort of flypaper trap, where they bog us down and stick us into this, and eventually the information never comes out. And nothing actually really is better for the more dictatorial regimes, particularly in Africa that I know about, than using the institutions that they have created in order to suppress information. So, for example, you talked about the African Court of Human Rights. In fact, it really is not the Human Rights Court. It is a human and people's rights, carefully inserted by the African Union to not ensure that it does not go into human rights too much, and balances that with what they call people's rights. And they have many judgments, but they make no difference because they are never enforceable. The African Union never enforces anything against its members. And so, to become entrapped in, as I say, the sticky, the fly paper system of the Commonwealth and these international organizations, is this the right way that we should actually work with them? Or should we use the light of transparency, where we actually denounce and explain what is happening in these organizations and the fact that they are actually covering up the failure to support journalists and support journalism? How long can we go on playing this game with them, where we engage with them without actually explaining what they are not doing, particularly when you have a situation like Rwanda, which is where the Commonwealth will now be hosting its gathering?
Thank you very much, Martin. Kieran, if I could ask you to put your question, and then it'll be panelists, and I'll put the question, hand the microphone to Mark. Kieran, if you could speak.
Yeah, thank you so much for a very, very necessary debate. My question is to all panel of speakers. How are we going to manage social media space as a platform which is Commonwealth as well as UNESCO, if they partner up? The traditional media, as we've seen in the discussion today, has been targeted by erosion of trust, draconian laws, hyper-nationalism, fake news. And in the case of, I would go back to South Asia, where Zaffar has been really articulated us with what the situation has been. So in the case of recently, we've seen that Imran Khan had this kind of biggest 1 million audience across the Twitter platform. And that was actually a debate. That was an alternative platform that he used to engage with the Pakistani citizens in this kind of incredibly problematic political turmoil that the country is going through, whereby most of his Twitter followers were from from the diaspora community all across the world. Now we are actually entering into a non-traditional media platform space, whereby I think individually a country where clusters of journalists within the countries, individual countries, may not be able to have a counter the kind of strength that social media platforms all across the globe are having. So my question to all of you is that how are the traditional journalists going to counter and remain influential with these social media platforms? And this is a very, very concerning, critical point, whereby we even having Elon Musk actually buying Twitter platforms. So this is a question to both Professor Harrison, Dr. Oslo, Zaffar Abbas, and William, that how is the kind of social media space going to be contested and dealt with for future media freedom principles?
Thank you very much, Kieran. I'm conscious of time, so I'm not going to add my remarks to it. William, the question from Martin about the value of international protocols and declarations if there is no enforcement and sanction.
Well, I mean, the point is so obvious. We are frustrated by that every day, aren't we? But this is the way the system works. And compared to some years ago, I mean, I've been very impressed to see this is through the intelligent and far-sighted work of individuals in organizations like UNESCO. As a matter of fact, the UN Action Plan grew out of a small bunch of British people getting together in a subcommittee of UNESCO as a civil society group, making a very modest proposal about having an action-oriented dialogue. And a year later, the UN Secretary General was chairing regular meetings to actually pass the UN Action Plan. So, I mean, you never know where things will lead. You've got to do all you can. And in the end, I agree, the balance of between the authoritarian and the liberal governments now in the world is going completely in the wrong direction. But to address your key point, for goodness sakes, all Commonwealth organizations should be speaking out on this. A small number of people are doing so, and it's often very awkward. It's very painful. And by the way, it's taken 6 years of very hard labor from myself, David, and others. We would like to see some fruit from this. And you want to have a courteous dialogue with the Secretariat. My bottom line is, if an organization says in its charter it believes in certain things, I would expect the people who represent it to assert that in their dealings with the member states. And they don't. And that, to me, is not good enough. Can I say more clearly than that? I've said that to many people inside that organization and indeed in governments, including our own, quite recently myself. So I agree with you entirely, Martin, and the culture of deference, the culture of silence is killing to journalism and killing to free and open societies and debate. I completely agree.
Thank you very much, William. Zaffar, would you like to respond to Kieran's question about the multifaceted challenges of social media and traditional journalism?
Well, I come from a media which already is being called legacy media. So to be very honest, I have very little knowledge of how the social media works. But she mentioned what Imran Khan did on Twitter Space about more than 500,000 or million people. That was such an impressive use of social media by a politician to express his views, to take questions, to engage with the supporters or sympathizers. That was perfectly, and this is what Imran Khan's party had been doing for a long time. They have developed this expertise in the use of social media to talk about their policies. What the problem that comes in is when whether his party or other parties in Pakistan, or they use their supporters for airing negative views about others, whether they are their rival politicians or particularly the journalists. And then it goes totally out of control. And what we are witnessing in Pakistan is that even now, even if these politicians or the security establishment or the government were try to control their supporters or these trolls, probably that time has passed. It has created such an intolerant atmosphere in the country that I don't know where it will go. But to answer Kiran's question that what to do with the social media, I don't think we can do much about it other than really campaigning that it is about the mainstream media, which is answerable to the people. People who take to the social media, we don't even know whether they exist, whether these are trolls or not, and whether they are accountable at all, whether there's fake news or genuine news, whether there's disinformation or misinformation. If I was to publish something or broadcast something, I am answerable to my people. If we make mistake, we are obliged to carry a correction or an apology. It doesn't happen on the social media. And that is one difference that needs to be highlighted.
Thank you very much, Zaffar. If I could take two questions, please. First of which from Dr. Mark Simpson, who's a visiting fellow at the Institute, and then Mr. Raymond Whitaker, who is now, I hope I have this right, chair of the UK branch of the Commonwealth Journalists Association. Mark, your question, please.
Thank you, Sue. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. A general question to the panelists. What did the COVID pandemic global health emergency and the associated regression in terms of media freedoms that accompanied that global pandemic reveal about weaknesses in terms of safeguards for media freedoms? What lessons have been learned? What appropriate remedial measures might be developed so that the next global health emergency that comes along, the same mistakes do not take place and authoritarian regimes are able to carry out the extension of their repressive rule under the cover of lack of media scrutiny.
Thank you very much, Mark. Raymond, your question, please.
Well, it's more of an observation that speaking from the point of view of the CJA UK, we did find within the Commonwealth that when we issued criticism of a Commonwealth member's attacks on the media, we were accused by that Commonwealth country's journalists of taking a colonialist attitude. So I just wanted to say that this was something that made it difficult for the Commonwealth to address issues in a particular country with one voice. So it's just an observation. Sorry, I also want to ask Zaffar to have a look at the chat. I've sent you a direct message because I've been trying to reach you about another Commonwealth conference. So if you could look at that, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Raymond. And just picking up on Martin's point about this focus of this discussion has been on Commonwealth institutions and South Asia. Of course, the Institute of Commonwealth Studies is running a series of events throughout the year, which has addressed expressly African media. We are going to be talking about media freedom. Expressly, the Africa context will come up in an event on the 27th of May and again on the 7th of June. So this is by no means the last word. It's part of a continuing conversation. and continuing debate. So if I could invite, please, Zaffar and William to respond to Mark's question about what did the pandemic reveal about in terms of safeguards, lessons learned, and necessary contingency planning around media freedom and access to accurate information in Commonwealth countries.
Yes, it was a very unique experience, at least in Pakistan. I have heard reports about how this pandemic was used by many countries or many rulers to suppress freedom of the press, and data is being compiled by many media organizations on this issue. Interestingly, Pakistan, where we are faced with a lot of challenges, a lot of problems about media freedom, this pandemic did not impact our coverage or our journalism in any way. Surprisingly, at no stage the pandemic was used an excuse to go after the media or to deny them information. Of course, there were challenges to the government statistics, there were detailed articles, analysis, and all those things. Government used to question them, used to deny them, but at no stage it was used to suppress media freedom yet. As I said, there are many other problems and challenges, but in this particular case, we never faced any real effort to suppress press freedom.
Thank you.
Well, in Europe, I think at least half of the countries enacted emergency laws, which went way beyond what was necessary. And in some cases, they didn't have a sunset clause. This is a very dangerous thing. It's a point I made very strongly in the Council of Europe, because if governments get in the habit of slapping state of emergency down, then they can take all kinds of powers. And that did happen in quite a number of countries. Certainly in terms of immediate access to information, I think it really brought a blanket down in countries almost all over the world, because you couldn't do press conferences, you couldn't collar politicians in person. It was much easier for politicians to fob people off with a single question on Zoom or just to be unobtainable. So those are really serious problems. But it's interesting to see that three of the most authoritarian governments in Europe have, in the last 2 months, I think, been ousted from power. In Slovenia, in Bulgaria, I'm trying to remember where the third one is. But anyway, so it's not all bad. Maybe people were aware of that, of the abuses going on. It did get to some pretty extreme levels, even in Europe, media capture and abuse of power. So, on the positive side, media did learn remote working. I mean, the UK really brought out fantastic capacity of the mainstream media to relearn new skills and to work, really complicated television production when people weren't even going into the office. It was very, very impressive. My final remark, I'd just like to say to Ray Whitaker, this is precisely part of our agenda. The Commonwealth has to be responsible for leading the repeal of these colonial laws, sedition laws and what have you, which are very convenient for authoritarian governments. And it's the Commonwealth's responsibility, institutional responsibility, and the member states, I would say, to enable that to happen, to encourage, to advise, to give expertise. It's one of the things that really is quite urgent to repeal those laws.
Thank you very much, William. Martin, a question for Dr. Martin Crook. You've already put one question, so I'm afraid I'm going to use the very limited remaining time just to take one question from the chat, which is from a graduate student from the Asia-Europe Institute, Sufi. The Asia-Europe Institute is at University of Malaya, Kuala Lumpur. Is there any collaboration or support through the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association in pushing for support on journalist protection through the Legislative Association? William, I know that you can make a comment on that. Zaffar, I don't know if you would like to add anything. If I could, William, first, if I could invite your response to that question.
Well, I think this is a really, really important point, and it hasn't really been enough of the focus. We've been, as a group of 6 organizations, we've been somewhat preoccupied with other things. Actually, I think the role of national parliaments is absolutely central. After all, they make the laws. There was a very good insight into that. There was Interparliamentary Union had an event in London. It must have been late 2018 or in 2019. And we really got an insight. We got parliamentarians, both government and opposition, saying how difficult it was for them to operate as independent voices in Parliament because of the pressure of reprisals from their party bosses and so on. So really the CPA, to my mind, should be really working to ensure that parliaments are, first of all, working in a way that parliamentary democracy is meant to work, with the opposition having genuine voice and power to hold to account. And also, Akbar Khan made the point very strongly in 2018 when we launched the principles first, saying that really this is a parallel oversight mechanism. The media and Parliament are both in oversight role towards the executive. And that is a role which is often forgotten, but which is absolutely central to parliamentary democracy, functioning democracy. And since the Commonwealth says it believes in that, I think that should be a high priority as well.
Thank you very much, William. Zaffar, would you like to add any comment to that?
I would have loved, but honestly speaking, I'm not qualified to comment on that. I have very little knowledge of that.
Okay.
So,
thank you very much. Colleagues, I'm very conscious that we've run over time, but I am enormously grateful to our panelists for their insights, for their perspectives on the national context, the multifaceted challenges that face Commonwealth countries, using the, if you like, the Pakistan example, but emphasizing Pakistan's particularity. So thank you very much indeed for that, Zaffar, but also for pointing to where there are possible areas for remedial action, where there are possibilities for reform, with a very clear eye and realistic appreciation of the multiple fronts and energies and actors who are going to be needed to sustain this in terms of the domestic environment, transnationally, and within the Commonwealth itself, and of course in the wider global community. William, our sincere thanks to you for your energy and your input and your detailed knowledge, and laying out so clearly yours, David's, and others who have been the stakeholders in the media freedom principles, concerted action to try to craft effective protocols which can be used as benchmarks in the most efficacious way. And this has genuinely been a campaign. This is not a battle. This has been a campaign of action. It is the need for resilience and perseverance, which I think has been a hallmark of this. So thank you. But our thanks also to the excellent questions which have been put by those with detailed knowledge and profound professional experience within this internet room, for the attention and focus of the audience, for highlighting the importance of the multiple pressures which are killing journalism, the dangers of the ideology of a single narrative, and the dynamics of authoritarianism, which Jackie spoke so powerfully to, and for emphasizing the positive role of media, journalists, editors, and those who are actively engaged in promoting accountability, transparency, and good governance in the interests of the peoples, with an S, of the Commonwealth. So thank you very much. We will be continuing this debate and this conversation, but I am enormously appreciative of all of your input. And I look forward to seeing you at other Institute of Commonwealth Studies events of this nature. So thank you very much indeed.